This is Amy.
This is Kelly, and you're listening to Diary of a Death Investigator. This week, we're on part 2 of our Idaho murder series, and this is going to be about how could something like this happen. So originally, Amy and I were doing a 5-part series. We were going to do a mini-series, like 20-minute episodes, but because we're long-winded...
You knew better.
Yeah. I don't know what I was thinking. So we'll probably be releasing these once a week, maybe a couple next week, depending on how good we get.
You should know better because literally we got on our Zencaster at 6:30 and we've been talking to each other for 2 hours before we even started doing our recording. So we should have known better, or Kelly should have known better. I knew better because we do this every time. So,
well, and to be fair, we did re-record our last episode because we didn't feel like the first take was very good, and Amy was not very happy with me.
You know what? I had a Sonic Red Bull Power energy drink, and I powered through. So I got through it for you people. So you're welcome.
So this week, we're going to talk about how something like this could happen in Moscow, any small town, really, because I think that was what I said in the last episode is what I'm most fascinated with. And I'll say why. We'll describe that. So then for episode 3, it's going to be about Amy's take on what a medical examiner or death investigator would look for at the scene and how she would process information. And then episode 4 is going to be about the forensics part. So we do know that they've found some stuff already, but how somebody from forensics would process it. And then our last episode is going to be about how the trial will, or what we think we'll see in the trial. And Amy will tell us
trials
what we
can
should
get
look for,
spicy,
things like that.
So you never know.
I'm watching the Jake Gyllenhaal show right now, Presumed Innocent. I know, I shouldn't watch that. I watch it before I go to bed, and I've had some really crazy dreams. But anyways, just about trial and things like that. So yeah, it's junk, but it gives me a little bit of anxiety. So I could imagine what this trial is going to be. I know. I was telling Amy about this today.
Hey, whatever powers you to get through your day, I guess. Well,
my life. It's my life. I like how your dogs just started barking because we have been talking for 2 hours, and now they decide to bark.
They know.
Literally every time, Amy, we start recording,
Stevie wants to be heard. She will be heard. She's old. She needs to be heard.
So, going back to small towns. So, I said this on the last episode. We grew up in a small town.
There could be smaller. I've been in really, really small towns out here where I am, where, there's kindergarten through high school where their whole grade is 20 people. So it's not that kind of small town, but yeah.
No, but we did say in the last episode, I think it's 22,000 people now. I think that it was maybe 15,000. It's been about 20 years since I've lived there. So I think maybe 15,000 people. But it's one of those towns that you grow up in, your parents grow up in, their parents grew up in it kind of thing. So legacy lives in the town. It's that house. Yeah. Everyone knows that house.
Well, we went to our high school
kind of town
where our dad went.
Yeah. So there's something to say about small towns in that they create habits. People go to the same restaurants. They sit in the same places when they go to the restaurants. They go to church. They sit in the same spot at church. Everything is habitual in some of it, right? So it's a routine. So when something doesn't feel right, the routine gets off. I remember sitting in church. I still remember what pew we sat in. And if somebody was out of place, you knew, right? So-and-so's not here today because they sat in the same spot every week. I say all of this because I think Moscow is very similar to the town that we grew up in because it's similar in size. The town we grew up in for having 22,000 people, it has like 21 or 22 churches. Moscow has about 34 churches. So it just kind of tells you what kind of community is there.
For a long time too, there was like a solid core community, like you said, where people grew up there and they stayed there as well. Like they didn't leave. I know like in our church, especially like the people in our church, like they built that church and then they stayed in that church. So there was like a lot of older people in our community. And so like their children and their grandchildren, like I know, especially with like farmers, like they had that land for like decades or like a century. And so like that was like their farmland that they had for like a really long time. So people like really knew each other really well. So I think that was kind of normal. Like then their neighbors were like other farmers and they played with, you know, other farmers' children, and this local school were like all the farmers' kids and stuff like that.
Well, and so you don't think about anything happening, right? Because you know everybody, and it's supposed to be safe. And because they would tattle on you too. So like, I was just telling Amy a story about how like, I remember coming home from school one day and Dad saying, "Oh, somebody sew your car out today." Like basically insinuating that I was ditching school. Just to be clear, I feel like I was a pretty good kid. I don't feel like I got in trouble. So yeah, I was off campus that day. Someone saw my car. It is because I was in yearbook and I was getting film developed. So I was picking up pictures. The bad kid in me. But that's the kind of town it was. Like someone sees you out, they tell your parents. So I assume that Moscow was very similar in this. And so when people say like, "Oh, things like this don't happen in our town."
Yeah.
That's why things don't happen.
Well, they recognize your car. Like they know whose car that is. Like, and if that's not the person that should be driving your car, there's something wrong. Probably even that parking spot.
Right. Well,
that is not your parking spot because Grandma Joe parks there every day for her morning breakfast with all of her lady friends, you know, or their Wednesday brunch that they do every other Wednesday, you know, whatever it is that they do. That's probably the normalities that you would see. And probably a lot of those ladies, that's what they do. They watch.
They do watch. And so again, this is just going back to, that's why some of these things don't happen. And you always recognize somebody still. Even when we go home now, we recognize somebody.
Sometimes, unfortunately, because like when I go home, which isn't very often, and I'm with, you know, some of my childhood friends that I still talk to from birth. And then he is a little chatty Cathy. And he'll be like, "Oh, hey." And I'm like, "No, don't say hi to them because I don't always want to be chatty with them." And I'm like, I didn't necessarily like them in high school. And they'll come over and I'm like giving them, you know, the death glare. And he's like, "So how's it going?" I'm like, "Stop talking to them. Like if I wanted to, you know, keep up with them, I'd be Facebook friends with them. And I'm not." So, yeah.
So when something's out of place and you just said it, people notice. And I think that's where I have a hard time understanding how somebody could come in, kill 4 students in a small amount of time, and then no one noticed. And I know we talked about this last week, how, it's a college town and, things happen. And I understand that too. I also recognize because it was so close to other towns, it doesn't mean that it wasn't like a commuter city. I don't know if it was or not. I mean, we do know that people were coming over from Washington because it was so close. But even then, the crime rate was very low. When I Googled how many murders were in Moscow, an article from Fox News popped up from 11/21/22. And it said that Moscow, Idaho had not recorded a murder in over 7 years before the college student slayings, which is like, that's pretty crazy, right? Like, to me, that means it was safe.
Which that's where you would want your kids to go to school, right? If your kids are moving away and out of state to go to school, you want to hear that. So,
well, and so the assumption is like, so when you hear about people like on the news talk about like, oh, we didn't think something like would this happen in our town, so now we got to lock the doors, which is basically insinuating that the doors weren't locked. Like, I can tell you, the town I live in, I don't think people are murdering people, but I do recall like some pretty intense things happening because people do dumb things. Like kids were posting things on Craigslist, like selling drugs or, fake selling drugs or whatever, Facebook posts. And then people would show up and rob their house. Like, I don't know. I think the kid was beat pretty bad. I don't know if he died or not, but.
So I will say, like, when you said, like, you get comfortable living in, like, those circumstances, when you are so used to living in a safe town like that where you know everybody, you do get comfortable with that. I will say that I live around some really amazing neighbors that have a bunch of cameras, and I know they look out for me and my house, and I have clearly killer beast dogs. Stevie is 120 pounds and she barks her head off. So I am not afraid, and, I should be to an extent, and I am packing, but I don't always lock all of my doors. And I take that for granted too, because I do feel safe. And where I live, if I know I'm going to run into a store real quick and just drop something off or just pick up an order, well, now I have a different vehicle, but in my other vehicle, I used to just leave my car running with the keys in it and just run in real quick and just grab whatever I was going to get, because I knew my car was still going to be there when I came back out, because that's just how this community is. Like, you weren't afraid to do those kinds of things. Now, not if I'm going into like Target or something, but if it's just like little restaurant or something like that, people weren't going to just get in your car and leave. This is that kind of community where people would probably do stuff like that. So granted, I will say I did look up some things. Now, where I live, it is bigger. So at the time when I moved here, my university is technically considered a commuter university. So the university at the time, it was back in 2011-ish when I started, 2010. So the university was right around 17,000 students, but literally like everyone knew like everybody, I would say. And it was like a little community. And like I said, that's like a lot of commuter students. So a lot of the students that lived on campus really knew each other pretty well. And then the ones that were technically a commuter, they lived in houses around the university. So the university was like a 2 square mile block. And then they had officers that lived on campus. And then literally the police department is, I don't know, 1.5 miles away, if even. So it's pretty safe. So now I think that has doubled because of like the forensics program, and they've built new facilities, which has helped it grow. The town population this is 2022, it's at 96,000. But I'm sure that varies because of the students and the time of the year. So it's grown a lot. There's a lot of people that are moving here from other states because of the cost of living. And then it is really close to a big, quote unquote, big city. So there again, people will commute to the bigger city and live here because it's technically considered the nicer town. But now, as of January of this year, there are, and this is just like in the metro, there are 67 homicides per year. So when you think about all those things, and that's not in my town that I live in, those are not happening in my town. So not in the university area, but like around the metro, like in the bigger city, which those are going to be like drug and gang related mostly. So, which you guys have heard about. So anything that's happened, anything like close to that has been like I think we talked about like the officer involved shooting with like the drug thing. So, and then there again, they're just like, oh my gosh, like this is something that is kind of rare, but there again, we're like in the metro. So bigger population as a whole, but college town. So yeah, when I first moved here, it wasn't as big. Everyone on campus knows each other, and you will start to know each other's vehicles as well. So I will say for probably those students, they probably knew what each other drove. I would say, especially seeing a vehicle of someone who might have looked like an older student, they'd be like, what is this old dude doing around here, like creeping around? Especially, like, I know if I was like a younger girl being like around there, if I was friends with those girls, I'd be like, ew, what is this old dude doing, like driving around? Like, what a creep, you know?
I think he was a vegan, and I think he was going to like a vegan vegetarian restaurant or a restaurant that had a lot of vegan options or vegetarian options. And I don't think it's uncommon to drive 8 to 15 minutes to go to a restaurant. I mean, I do it all the time.
But driving through the fraternity row?
No, I do think that that's weird, but like, I don't know how the roads connected because it was kind of like a circle. So if you maybe got down one street and like did a circle around because you were like, we'll hear about this later, but there was like a gas station very close by that caught him on or the vehicle, the alleged vehicle on camera. There was also like an apartment complex that was right over there. And I think that, you know, he could have looked like a teacher or a TA or something like that too. So,
yeah,
you know,
I still think that would be creepy. I don't know. Like, and maybe I was more hyper aware of those people when I was that age, like thinking like, ew, like, why is there like an older dude like driving around? Because we'll talk more like in another episode about like his phone pinging in that area multiple times. So, and maybe he did it at different times to where he wasn't ever noticed. So I think that will come out in court too. Like if he was on campus ever, like actually on campus, or if he was ever actually out of his vehicle, that's something that I'm going to be interested in as well to find out.
We know that with small towns, there's not like, I shouldn't say small, but I guess it's small, like a small law enforcement agency.
Yeah.
So what?
It's funding.
Okay. So, but can you explain then how small towns react to calls like this? Or, I mean, we'll talk about it later, but like what kind of impact that will have on like something, because we're talking about like how something like this happens. Well, my assumption is if it's a small town, they don't have a lot of police officers. And so therefore, like some of these things that may kind of pique someone's interest aren't really worth it to like check out because maybe they don't have the resources to check it out.
So I don't know if the university itself had just campus security or if they had their own police force for one.
Well, this house wasn't on campus though.
Oh, okay. So I would say,
at least not to my knowledge, because it sounds like somebody owned the home.
Okay. I know a lot of times that's who would originally first respond if it was like a campus residence, because I know sometimes the campus or the schools will buy homes like that around the campus, or at least like my university has started to do that. And then like renting them out, like renovating and renting them out. And so, and especially if they're like right there, like next to fraternity row as well, if they're already within the area, if they're like the closest to respond, like they will definitely do that. If it's within if they're trying to save someone, they're definitely going to try to get there and save lives if they can. Because when that call comes in, all you probably hear are like there's bodies and like they don't know if they've been checked or not to see if they're alive. So typically in a town of this size, a town is only allotted so much money for funding a police agency. And even in saying that, and maybe because there is a university, that they even have their own police force. A lot of times, cities that are of a small capacity will just have even just a sheriff's department. So probably in saying that this is a university town, they do have their own police force. So
they did, because it sounds like they assigned, I read somewhere that it said Moscow. Oh, I think it was the same Fox News article that they assigned 4 detectives, 24 patrol officers, and then 5 support staff and employees to the case.
Yeah. So typically, like small towns, just because the amount of funding that it takes to have your own police force and not be that big of, because think about how much money it costs to have just 4 sergeants on a force. And then you have like just your lieutenants that are going to be like on duty, just driving around. And then you have like your detectives. So you have like your different rankings of your police officers that are on the force. And then you just have like your investigations. And then do they have their own forensics unit, which would be part of your investigative unit as well. So
would that be like one of the 5 support staff employees?
And that could be, unless they went ahead and like they contracted somebody out. So they may have had to hire a separate entity out. I know like here in my state that I'm currently in, this is where we would go ahead and have a state bureau investigations unit come step in and take over this type of investigation.
And that would be FBI, right?
No, that's federal.
Oh.
So you have your state come in because they're going to have more money and more manpower to come in. And usually they're the ones that have like the forensics unit. And mostly they have more funding and more time to take on basically the investigations process. So basically, it would allow for like Moscow PD to allow or release their other people to go back into like regular duties, or to allow like maybe one detective to stay on this case with the State Bureau or with the FBI, whoever's working this, because of probably the amount of manpower that they don't have. Because if you think about it, there are other small petty crimes that are happening at the same time as this case. So you're going to have things like DUIs and petty theft, other things like that, like traffic stops that are still going on that you need your Moscow PD to still be doing. Now, the reason why the FBI is involved in this case is because, one, Brian lived in another state. He lived across state lines in Washington. And then when he was arrested, or technically he is being watched by the FBI as he was traveling back home to Pennsylvania. So he was arrested in Pennsylvania, and then he had to be extradited back to Idaho. So this is happening within multiple states. And so that's why this is a federal case.
Oh, because the FBI did have 22 investigators in Moscow, 20 agents in other areas of the U.S., and then 2 behavioral analyst unit agents working on the case as well. So explain this real fast. I know this is kind of off topic of like why something like this would happen, but like what are the behavioral analysts that they're talking about?
Basically, I mean, like the behavioral analysts are going to be the ones that are going to be like, he would fit this profile because of...
Or she, because we didn't know at the time.
Yeah, whoever the suspect could be. But they're basically just profiling him. So behavioral analysts are going to be someone who's going to be like, this person that would commit this type of crime is going to be someone who would be like a loner and would probably like do something to animals, that would have probably been a bully or been bullied, something like that. They would start picking out traits, and then they would probably say they've been stalking people. They just pick out all these traits of someone. And honestly, it's kind of scary to see how closely related that they are to what they fit with the suspect. So they basically, it's kind of a hard job to get. I don't really think that there are that many jobs in the FBI for that anymore. Everyone wants to be a behavioral analyst now because of shows.
Yeah.
So
with all this being said about like the small police forces and the small one that was in Moscow, or my assumption is of it being small in Moscow, do you think that plays into, I guess my thought process is, okay, if someone was going to commit murder and they are watching the police officers and they know that they have a small unit and they're not going to pay that much attention to them, do you think that was taken into consideration by somebody?
Yeah. What you'll see, I think what we'll see, like when they looked at like the pings of his phone, you'll see like certain times that his phone was pinging at, and it was like early morning hours. And I think that was pretty close to when you would see like a change of shift for police officers. So he could have been watching. I mean, like we know, he was studying criminology. So he knew what to look for. He could have been observing certain routes that they were driving or where police officers were sitting watching traffic. He could have been watching these things. Also, we know that he was trying to get on as a intern for the Pullman Police Department that was in where he lived, correct?
Yes.
In Washington. So I think, he was trying to integrate himself into that police department, which is also, I think, probably a pretty small police department as well. So I think he was trying to take advantage of that. But I think that what you have maybe, I don't know what the square footage is, but if you think about the square footage to police officers that you have on duty or on shift at a time, the more spread out they are, right? And then think about, okay, if they're on a call and then they need backup, that's spreading them more thin. So if you have, let's say, 6 officers on duty at a time, we'll just say that. And then you have someone pulled over and you're trying to search them, and then you call for backup. Okay, so you have 2 officers on a scene. And then, so that means you have 4 officers then that you have to watch because you know where 2 are at one time. I don't know. Did he have maybe a police radar, like, in his vehicle that he could listen to where he knew where they were at? Now, that's just an assumption. I'm just saying.
Well, they're definitely easier to track if he like went on some website and like could calculate how many people were in the area. And then like if he heard, I mean, I would think it would be at 4 a.m. It would be pretty quiet. Although we say that and we know that this is a weekend and we know that the sorority houses were having parties. So maybe the police were active at night, and maybe 4 o'clock in the morning was the most opportune time for a person to go into the house because they're like, okay, they're done partying, right? Bars close. I don't know what time the bars close at Moscow, but my assumption is like 1:32. Everyone starts going home, and okay, late night eats or whatever. So okay, 3 o'clock by the time you get in bed. And so 4 o'clock's that hour that it's still dark. And then, because people like early birds usually get up 5:30. I don't know very many people who get up at 4 a.m. So,
especially there, right? It's cold. I don't know. You'd have to be a very dedicated person to get up that early to go for a run in the cold there.
Well, and again, I don't know. Right. I don't know about the apartment that was next door and like how many or the type of people that were in there. I think probably it was college kids also. Because who wants to live in that area with a bunch of college kids?
If it's cheap enough.
Yeah. But, so if it's loud, I'm just thinking the opportune time. So if you're right about a time change, like a shift change in law enforcement, and then it's quieted down because it's early in the morning.
Yeah. I don't know how, and who knows how many were actually on shift at a time or when they changed shifts, because I think it's different for probably every department. And maybe it differs for weekends or holidays, whatever, which I'm sure, it's like working New Year's or whatever. They probably have more people active during certain times or during certain shifts. I think they have more people working at night, or they have people working together at night. So who knows? It could vary. I think that he was definitely aware of all this. And if he had planned this out the way that he had, I think he was definitely watching. Who knows? He could have probably even known or knew who these policemen, women were that were working shifts or on duty. Because I think you can look up on certain websites. We have these people on staff. You can probably look up. I mean, gosh, you have to give your name and badge number now when you go up to police officers, when you ask them. So I don't know. We don't know a lot of things just because he hasn't.
And we're saying he as like that Brian Koberger did it, but it's alleged. He hasn't been convicted of this crime.
Right.
And this is just an assumption that we're going off of like everything. So whether it's him or not, in my mind, somebody knew all the inner workings, the law enforcement.
With the information that we're given at this time,
right.
This is just the assumption.
Right.
So we don't have a lot of information right now because the trial hasn't started. And so they're holding that close to the chest because obviously they don't want to put that out there for the media or for opposing sides before a trial begins. And obviously you can't do that anyways, which we'll talk about when we're referring to the trial for their jury.
So something else that I thought was interesting, and this will pop up probably in a later episode as well, so I don't want to go too in depth on it, maybe possibly the next one. There was 2 survivors in the house. So 6 people living in the house, or 6 people were staying that night, 2 survivors. One of the survivors had said they saw the suspect and that he had bushy eyebrows.
Yeah.
Then didn't call police until like 11 something the next morning. So we know that this happened at 4 in, between 4 and 4:25. This person saw the suspect in the house. Mm-hmm. And that was her observation, was that he had an athletic build and bushy eyebrows. Do you think that she didn't call police because she thought maybe she might have known the person because it was a small town or because of the situation?
Oh,
like maybe I know this person. Because what we also know is she's not the one that called 911. We know that it was some other kid that called 911 that had gone to the house.
Well, and then, it was a while before it was even released that there was a second survivor even in the house, because I think for a long time, it was just said that there was just one survivor in the house. So when did it even come out that there was a second?
I actually don't remember. I assume that they knew that there were 2 because of the picture that was taken the day of. Well, and that's the other thing. There was a picture taken the day of the murder, like only a few hours, I think, before, and it was posted on a social media page. And it's still, I think, on their pages now. And it was of all 6 of them in the house together.
Oh.
Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised, like, if we find out later if
They were texting each other, weren't they?
Well, yeah. And we can talk about that. I don't want to talk about that right now because I don't know that pertains to like how something like this could have happened. I mean, I guess it does in some way because in my mind, it should have been stopped right away. And you and I have ideas of why it wasn't. And I think maybe we talk about that like later. That could be like forensics or some sort of evidence, like digital evidence that they pick up that the 2 girls could have been texting. I'm just saying, like, if you open the door and you see somebody and then you don't call the police until 11 o'clock, or somebody doesn't call the police until like 11 o'clock the next day or that later that day in the morning, is that because you thought maybe you knew who that person was?
I think that's a really good question. And
it's like, do you start calling your friends going, hey, there was somebody in the house last night? Do we know anybody with bushy eyebrows?
I think actually, yeah, or if you call those people to say, hey, were you at the house last night? Because why else would you do that instead of calling 911 for your friends?
And is it because you were texting people? Like, did you go back to bed and start texting people and say, like, were you at my house? Do you know somebody's at the house right now? Like, do you know? Because we do know, again, safe town, right? Like, it wasn't like there weren't houses around.
But why wouldn't you just call out to them?
Well, I mean, I also am like, you hear a scream, you have to hear screams. And so you and I will talk about that. I feel like when we talk about what does a medical investigator look like or forensic evidence, like in my mind, because I feel like this episode kind of blends in with the next one a little bit or blurs a little bit into the next one.
Yeah.
Because in my mind, I hear everything. My cat cries and I'm like, I can hear everything.
I know. And it's hard to say when you're not in that situation too. And she's a young girl. So I can't, that's hard. I don't know.
And we know the house is a party house. So like it could possibly at 4 a.m. are drug deals happening. I'm not saying that the kids were on drugs because I think the toxicology came back that they weren't. But like, is that something that they were purchasing late at night? A dealer comes in. Like, I don't know, right? Because supposedly there was a known dealer around there somewhere. That person could have been from Pullman.
Where are there not dealers anywhere? There's drugs everywhere. If you want drugs, you'll find them. I'm just saying.
True. So I'm speculating at this point. Again, how could something like
I think that's a really good question. Because I think that it's probably one of the reasons why there was a lot of texting going on. But there again, we don't have their phone logs, which I think are probably going to be presented in court. So
we're going to talk about some forensics evidence that I found from the sleuthing show that I watched. We're going to talk about some things.
I said yours.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've had my own sleuthing. I think, again, we're just trying to figure out the why, right? So, why all these things? Why didn't anybody call? Could the person who was on the first floor been wearing earplugs? I wear earplugs every night. I can still hear through the earplugs, but is it because they were so used to people coming in and out of the house that they would wear earplugs? Or I've shared a room with a colleague and she wears AirPods or earbuds to bed because she listens to music and that's how she goes to sleep. So, people say that they watch TV. Could TVs have been on, right?
Yeah, that's a good
there's
point.
a lot of things. And we know that one of the victims was watching TikTok. And so could she have had earbuds in and didn't hear certain things? So I think to me, all these, I've just been trying to come up with in my mind, all these different scenarios of how something like this could happen. Because to me, it's just so crazy. When you hear about mass murders, there's usually not somebody who saw it, right?
Yeah, there's not a survivor.
And now
because they don't want to be identified.
Right. And now we have 2. So that's because, in my mind, again, this person knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly what they were going in for. They knew, I think it was so focused that maybe we'll see with the evidence that is out, maybe it threw him off a little bit, or he or she, whoever did it. Right now we're just saying Brian Koberger because he's the one
he's indicted.
Yeah. So, but that's, there's a lot of mysteries out there. So I guess my last question to you, well, I have 2. So do you think that the murder went in more than one target?
Oh, I know I've read stuff where one of the girls' dad thinks that she was the initial target because she's said to her family that she had a stalker, and basically these other people were just collateral damage. But there again, there's 2 other people that are survivors, so that really doesn't make sense to me. But it's kind of a weird grouping of victims, because why would there be 3 girls and 1 guy, especially a guy that is of such a large build?
6'4", I think is what I read he was.
Yeah, he's pretty big to take on. I mean, I guess he would have to be inhibited. I guess him sleeping is a vulnerable position.
And we'll talk about whether I think he was sleeping or not in the next episode.
I don't know. There's not enough evidence for me to say, like, I would have to know if they had been, like, stalked or if they had any enemies. I mean, it sounded like they were pretty well-liked people that had a lot of friends.
Okay. So I have another question then for you, and this is my last question, and it's kind of piggybacks off of that. In your opinion, was this mass murder thought out?
Yes, because the fact that unless this girl is lying, that she didn't ever state that in anything that I've read, now I'm not an investigator in this situation, that she didn't hear him opening and closing doors, which would slow down his process. It doesn't sound like he was looking for a murder weapon. It sounds like he came with a murder weapon.
So when you say opening and closing doors, you just mean like other doors looking for the victims.
What is the purpose of breaking into someone's home, first of all, except for burglary, correct?
Yes.
What would be the purpose of breaking into someone's home?
Also, what I read about burglary is like you don't, just so we're clear, because I thought burglary was just when you're stealing something, but it doesn't have to be necessarily stealing something. It could just be entering someone's home with the intent to do something bad.
Correct. So robbery then is then escalated by like with a weapon. Okay. So, and then robbery with like the intent to kill. So if it was someone looking for drugs, unless they knew exactly where those drugs were and then who was there and what rooms they were in, they would have to know what rooms they were in. So if those kids had drugs in their room, wouldn't they lock the door, first of all, to the sliding door and to the front door? So that person would have to have a key or no way to get into the home. And then they would also have to probably break down the doors if they didn't have, and then even just the bedroom doors. They would have to know where these people are sleeping, know who was even there. The one girl wasn't even supposed to be there, and she had a brand new car.
And she had a dog in another room, so the dog was across the way.
Right. So if you're not even familiar with the home, you'd be opening and closing doors. You'd be rifling through drawers. So the one girl that opened her door 3 or 4 times, however many times it was, she would have experienced him opening her door because apparently he just walked by her door and didn't even bother her. So why? That doesn't even make sense to me.
I think Ethan heard him. I think the gentleman who was murdered heard him. And so I think that was part of it. Like he said, somebody's here. I know that somebody said somebody's here. She heard that.
Did he come out into the hallway and confront him?
That's what I'm thinking. And I want to talk about that next week, but that's what I'm thinking.
Like, that's my thing. It's like, why wouldn't you then? He had to have come into that house with a plan, with an intent. He had it planned. He knew the layout of this home. Like, how do you walk past these certain rooms and be like, gotcha. Like, no, I mean, like, to me, to do whatever in 16 minutes or however many minutes they got this time frame down, you have to be very structured and planned and have a weapon. You don't come into a place with a mask on wearing all black, first of all, without some malicious intent, period. So I'll leave it at that.
So just to recap this episode, how do things happen in small towns? Well, I think we assume that small towns are safe because everybody knows each other. There is a familiarity. How do you say that? Familiar.
Yes. I will say you get comfortable. You get comfortable and then you stop watching and you start being too nice to people and you let your guard down.
I think that's what happened. My assumption is that's what happened. I think that, you do see somebody who's like maybe suspicious or, oh, you don't want to be mean to them, or because that's not the type of town, Again, I referenced churches earlier, mostly because I was thinking like, and this is just a stereotype, but right, like Christians are supposed to be nice people or religious people are nice people. And they, oh, if somebody wouldn't do that, or, that wouldn't happen here. Mostly because you think there are so many religious people. 34 churches is a lot of churches for.
Yeah.
So, I think they're supposed to be generous. They're supposed to be charitable. So like if you see somebody, you wouldn't think like, oh, this person's just having a hard time or, whatever. So if Brian Koberger was visiting a restaurant in Moscow, Idaho, and he was eating by himself, maybe people just felt sorry for him. They knew who he was. He was maybe nice, but it was like, oh, poor guy is just eating by himself, So that's the beauty of small towns, because those people are like that. But then again, like
sometimes you need to be kind of mean.
I don't have a problem with that.
I know you don't.
Firm. I say boundaries. I think people need to have boundaries. I think that's really important. And then again,
that's a good word. Yeah.
And then I think like circling back again, just because they probably thought they knew the person, my assumption is that too. And, when somebody, especially if you think been in your house and they know what they're looking for, like, I think they thought they knew the person. I think their survivors thought they knew who it was. That's what I'm going to finish with. I really, really, truly believe that they thought, oh no, it's someone we know. And then like the why, right?
Yeah. I guess we'll find out when trial comes around.
Well, if you have any questions for us on this, or if there's something that you've found interesting about the case so far and that you'd like to share with us, you can email us at kelly@diaryofadeathinvestigator.com, or you can message us on our Instagram page, Diary of a Death Investigator.
Hey, Belgium.
Oh, yeah.
Great work.
We picked up some listeners in Belgium. Thank you guys for listening. That's been a real treat for us.
You're my hero.
And until next time.
Bye.